Hello again. After we've gone through last week about the Shoah, today we want to talk a few minutes about Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom Ha'atzmaut. And we'll also find here in our Tanakh, in our Bible, many hints which are talking about this period. Amazing. I'm transferring over to chapter Psalms chapter 107, which is opposite you. I try to make the letters quite big so it will be apparent, it will be seen. And this chapter is amazing because this chapter we say between Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, it's the first prayer that we go into shul. We lately can't go into shuls, but we start our prayer with Yom Ha'atzmaut, with this Psalm 107. And this is amazing because the chief rabbis in the independence, Harav Herzog and Harav Nisim, amazingly, if they're not considered as prophets, at least they certainly had a prophecy here. I don't know if they really knew. I think they knew something, but they really, I don't know if they deep down thought that this chapter, which was written 3,000 years ago by David HaMelech, David HaMelech, saw in a vision, amazing vision, about this period we're talking about, the last 100 years, which is amazing. I'll soon express why is it especially talking about these 100 years and no other time. So here we won't read the whole chapter, only the certain verses or the certain phrases that I've bolded in yellow or in green. So let's start in yellow at the beginning of the Psalms, and it's written there at verse number 3, and gathered from the lands, from the east and from the west and from the north and from the south, which means Jews came back to Eretz Israel. Now, never in history have we ever come back through 4 directions, not by 3 and not even by 2 directions. Always when we went out to exile, we've always come back either from the north to the south or either from the east to the west. If it was from Babylon, if it was first from Egypt, we came from the west to the east, one direction. If we came back from Babylon after the first exile, 70 years, we came back from the north to the south. Or if we came back at the second temple, or after the destruction of the second temple, and Jews slowly strolled back, they came back usually from the east, or some periods they came through walking from Istanbul or from Europe, but never came from 4 directions. From 4 directions only happened in the last 100 years. When we're talking about the Ha'apala, we're talking about the Aliyot, the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, the third and fourth Aliyah, which happened just before the independence of our state. Okay, so here's already one hint that we are talking about something spectacular that never happened before. Afterwards, I'm going back to the 4th verse onwards, and I divided it in certain houses, like every song has got houses, things that repeat themselves with a chorus, and I bolded in green 4 different types of redemptions that people should say Toda Rabbah, should be thankful to the Lord. And by the way, the Talmud says that 4 different aspects that you've gone through, bad occasions, you should pray and thank Hashem. And the Chazal took it from, of course, from this chapter 107 from Tehillim, and it gives you all the 4 different aspects. One is desert, if you can see at verse number 4. If I go down at the first column, the second one is sickness, and sickness is to do with darkness and shadows of death. We'll soon talk about it. I'm going up to the second column. Again, darkness and shadows of death. It repeats it in that house. And then I'm going to the verse 17 and onwards. We're talking about people were afflicted and went through gates of death. We're talking about people who were locked up in dungeons or in terrible prisons and were redeemed. That's the third one. And the fourth event is people who have left sea or gone through long seas and long voyages through terrible seas, going to sea. And have a look at the next verse here, 25. Storms and winds and the seas nearly drowned people and they still come. Okay, these four different elements, by the way, exactly happened to Am Yisrael when they came out of Egypt. We've just finished Pesach and we're talking about that they were in a dungeon, definitely one of the worst dungeons ever in history. The second thing is sickness. Many were sick and many were in bondage, being beaten up, died, but the ones who survived managed to come out. Of course, they went through the desert, and of course, they went through the sea, and we're talking about the Red Sea. But here, something is amazing, because if we go through all these different types of events, the events are put much stronger by certain phrases which didn't exactly always happen in Egypt. If we're talking about the desert, yes. And then I'm going to number 10, in darkness, in shadow of death. Now, of course, they were Am Yisrael in Egypt in bondage. But to say that they were in darkness and shadow of death, I'm not so sure that they all felt like that or they all suffered like that. How do I know? Because later, and we're reading through the Torah, through the different parashot, we can see the grumbling of Am Yisrael against Moshe, against Hashem, and they keep repeating, why did you take us out of Egypt? What is the big want to go back to Egypt if it was such a darkness and terrible place? So we can imagine, yes, they suffered, but they also had food, they also had possibility of being sort of enlarging themselves, sort of managing between the terrible times. This, which is written in such a terrible way, shadow, darkness and shadow of death, and then it's repeated on the second column here, up here. Again, let's see number 14. He brought them out of darkness and shadow of death and broke their bands apart. I think it also relates much more to the Shoah, and that was really darkness and shadow of death. Never in history have we ever gone through terrible times like this. Later, it's written in verse number 17, iniquities were afflicted, and again, gates of death. Can you see at number 18 in the green? We know that they suffered in Egypt very much. I wouldn't like to be there, but definitely some people didn't have it so hard. I can imagine that, for instance, the Leviim that stayed not inside the midst of Egypt, but were in Goshen, and they didn't move out from their ghetto. I'm talking about ghetto in a positive way, that they were only Jews there, and they were isolated, but they were isolated in a good way, and probably the bondage wasn't so bad. But here we're talking about gates of death, reminds only of the Shoah, the most terrible times. If we go down and we see the next house of this song, the longest house of this song is from verse 23, and it's the longest, because all the houses before we're talking about 6 or 7 verses, and here we're talking about nearly 10 verses. Number 23, those who go down in the sea on ships, in ships who had the business in great waters and so on. And if we go down to verse 25, where he spoke and raised up a stormy wind which lifted up the waves of the sea, and we can carry on and talk about the sea and the sea and the sea, and you can see how long this whole paragraph is dealing. Never in history, by the way, never in history, we've had so many people coming to Eretz Yisrael through ships. Yes, of course, we had a few aliyot. We're talking about Rabbi Yehuda Levi that came by ship. We're talking about tens of people, perhaps hundreds of people. We don't have thousands and not tens of thousands through the whole history. Even fleeing away from the Inquisition of Spain, we know that people did come, but already in small groups. Many of them stayed in Italy for some time. Many of them came to Istanbul and later came by foot from there. But we don't have ever in history amazing an influx of tens of thousands, nearly 100,000 people arrived by boats. And here we're talking about the last 100 years. We're talking about the Aliyah, the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, the third, fourth Aliyah that came by boats. Many were stopped, many were brought back to Europe, to the Nazi Europe. Many were sent off to prisons in the prisons in Cyprus by the English, but most of the Jews managed to arrive. And I think David HaMelech, when he was talking about 3,000 years ago, when he talking about Jews coming to the land by boats, the only time that I can say in the whole history is talking about this 100 years, the last 100 years, coming in storms and managing to survive and coming by boats. And you can see that this paragraph is the longest paragraph, and it's definitely got a sign of something special happening. The next two parts of this song is talking about also things that only happened in the last 100 years. If we go to verse number 35, where I've embolded in yellow, he changes the wilderness into a pool of water and the dry land into springs of water. We know, of course, Mark Twain that wrote 150 years ago when he wrote about the voyage to the Holy Land, and he wrote a diary about that. And of course, the voyage to the Holy Land, it was making fun of it, because actually when he came to the Holy Land, he saw how the land was dry, and he was complaining severely that he saw barely any people running around. Everything is so dry. He saw one palm or two palm trees near the Kinneret. Hey, look at the Kinneret overflowing, Baruch Hashem, and all the greenery around it, all the kibbutzim, the moshavim, and so on. They saw two palm trees. He writes in his diary that between walking for miles and miles, once in 10 or 15 miles, he saw a tent of Bedouin. That's all there was. And here we're talking about exactly after Mark Twain left this country, 12 years later, only 12 years later, the Baron Rothschild and Montefiore and the Baron Hirsch gave money, especially we're talking about Rothschild, and they made the land green. They brought money, and let's look what is written here, the continuation. It's amazing, as if David saw them coming and building the inhabited city. By the way, you see the top line on the second column in yellow, inhabited city. In Hebrew, it's written the word Moshav, Ir Moshav. Now, the word Moshav only applies usually to the Moshavot that the Rothschild built in Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov, the first Moshavot. And have a look at the continuation of verse 37. And sow fields and plant vineyards. What was the first thing that Rothschild wanted the people to enjoy and to feel that they can become sort of earn some money from the land, especially by vineyards. So this is amazing. David saw this 3,000 years ago. Have a look at verse number 38. Also he blessed them and they multiplied greatly, and it only happened in Eretz Israel. Amazing, everything was so prosperous, everything grew, everything became flourishing, only the last 100 years. Like I said, immediately after Mark Twain, and he's one of so many other Edim, so many other witnesses that came and saw Eretz Israel was empty. But immediately after he left, came an influx of Jews and built up the greenery, of course, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The last paragraph is talking about, amazingly, also things that Jews only then realize that here HaKadosh Baruch Hu is bringing us to the Geulah, bringing us to redemption. And have a look in the yellow, and makes his family like a flock. And we're talking about, especially after last week, we're talking about the Shoah, we're talking about the people that were the only person alive from a whole family. They got married, came to Eretz Israel, and suddenly they have hundreds, if not more, of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So here, you people are definitely an evidence for that a century that has gone through such terrible times. Some of you have gone through these terrible times, and you managed to come, survive, come to Eretz Israel, and build these enormous flocks of family. Baruch Hashem, you should have more and more and more. The last verse in this chapter is, and consider the long the loving kindness of the Lord. I think that between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaTzmaut, which is so close to each other, you cannot see that in 3 years after the Shoah, Eretz Israel became Medinat Israel, and you can see the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to rebuild the Jews, and we can't not say Hallel and bless the Lord for all the greatness and all what has happened. I think this is one of the amazing hints in the Tanakh that show, yes, times will come that from such gates of hell, you can come into such gates of Gan Eden. Halevai, please God, we only see goodness also in these days that we are locked up. We all can see that I'm in my house, in my salon, in my main room, and also locked up. And the only way to bring you this lecture is by this method. We hope to meet soon together and make a big kiddush and a big simcha. Kol tuv, later.